Welcome to Conversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host, and today I'm going to talk about what's happening in Europe. It appears that the Nazis are coming back. The rise of right-wing parties in Europe with each progressive election is getting frightening, more and more scarier. It appears as if Europe is returning to the Europe of 1930s and 1940s with the rise of fascism, especially with Hitler and then Mussolini and others. And remember this, the enlightened Europe was very good. I mean, after Enlightenment, the Europe became very good at genocidal wars. They committed the Holocaust, perhaps the greatest crime against humanity in the history of humanity. Then there's other genocides in Europe, including in Bosnia. And of course, these same enlightened Europeans then committed all kinds of violence in Africa, killed millions of people in Africa, in India, the Jallianwala Bagh by the British. There are many such examples, and of course, what happened in North America, the elimination of basically the Native American population is not something that is unknown. So we are familiar with the kind of violence that Europeans, with the rise of European nationalism or European fascism, is capable of. So these elections are, I'm wondering, are they telling us that there's going to be a terrible future with regards to Europe? So anyway, I'm going to make 6 points with regards to the elections in Germany, and that should be, I guess, more than enough to make you all think and ponder about what is happening in Europe. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to Conversation, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share this video with your socio-political network. So the first thing is that over this weekend, Germany had its provincial elections in 2 of its provinces in East Germany, Thuringia and Saxony. And what happened here is that a party called AfD, Alternative for Germany, basically got the number 1 position with more than 30% or 33% of the seats in Thuringia, and in the neighboring Saxony, they came second. So it is quite possible that they could, in theory, form governments. But at the moment, all political parties in Germany are determined not to essentially go into a coalition with this particular party. The AfD is labeled by German intelligence and security apparatus as an extremist organization. So it's like saying that you are in Iraq and you're having elections and ISIS has come first in a regional election. Of course, if this was Iraq and it was ISIS, everybody in the West would be asking, why is ISIS allowed to run for office and compete in elections in Iraq? But AfD is already labeled and is being investigated by the German authorities as an extremist organization, and yet it has won. So that tells you 2 things. 1, where the public is, and 2, where the government is. Either the government is completely wrong about labeling AfD as an extremist organization when it has such popular support in certain parts of Germany, or the German population has become extremely radicalized and extremist, and that they are indeed voting for an extremist organization because they support the extremist agenda of this party. Now, this election in Germany is not a one-off elections. So in the past few months, you had first a European election in which right-wing parties won in a very handsome way. And then you had the French elections in which in the first round of elections, clearly Le Pen, the extreme right party, was leading. And of course, there was some last minute coalition building by the far left. And so ultimately what happened was the far left came first and the far right came second in the second round of elections, where actually the far left parties made a lot of sacrifices, which means wherever they were third in the first round of elections, they withdrew. I think more than 200 of the 500 plus seats that the French parliament has. And of course, Macron's center party finished third or last. I mean, there are other tiny small parties, but the center-right coalition of Macron came third in that election. And there is still chaos in France. Just yesterday, Macron refused to give the leftist parties the right to form government, is not inviting them to form government. He's just saying that nobody is going to work with them. Exactly what Germans are saying about AfD in Thuringia. Macron is saying the same about far left in France, that no one is going to support it, the government is going to collapse. And then, well, if the government is going to collapse, is Macron's center-right party then going to form a coalition with the far-right Le Pen to form a government? We shall see. Apparently, Macron is having conversations with Le Pen. And as far as the British election was concerned, yes, there was. It appeared like going against the trend in Europe, with Labour Party beating the Tories after nearly 14 years. Well, the Tories were really incompetent, especially Rishi Sunak's government was pretty useless. And British economy was doing bad. The public was very angry. Even basic systems were not working in England. And so they just threw out the Tories. But two things happened. One, that the extreme right party in England, Reform Party, even though it got only 4 seats in the parliament, it did win a very high percentage of votes. And some people feel that basically the Tory vote became more extreme and went far right because of the incompetence of the Tories. So if the moderate right was incompetent, they are giving an opportunity to the extremist right with Nigel Farage and others. But what also happened is that the entire country of England moved right. So not only that the Reform Party is up and in Parliament, which for the first time, and then the Tories still got reasonably close to the total amount of vote share that they got, even though they did not get the same amount of seats in the parliament. But the Labour, which gained a lot, gained by moving to the right. So everybody in England have moved to the right. So now the British voter has righter and far right as options with Labour, Tories, and Nigel Farage's Reform Party. So basically, Europe is moving right and right and right. And that is the first thing that comes out of this election. I've written down my points here so that I don't forget it. The second point that I wanted to make was this about what is happening with the center parties. The centrist parties, I mean, these are the neoliberals who are, who are business friendly as well as multicultural friendly, immigrant friendly, who respect human rights and minority rights. That is the liberal center of Europe. That is what people like Tony Blair and others represented, at least in the early days. And that is the one that is collapsing. So what you are seeing in the British and European elections is that the extremes are on the rise. Look at the French election. The far right performed phenomenally well in the first round. In fact, in the second round, it did get a higher vote share than in the first round, the far right. So it's around 37%, exactly like the far right BJP in India, 37% of the. But what has also happened is the rise of the far left. And you're seeing that in some parts of it, but not so much in Germany. In one of the provinces of those two provinces, even the far left has done well. So that raises the question, why are the extremist parties, whether they are on the far right or far left, doing well? If you remember the 2020 election, if the Democratic Party had not rigged the primaries, they seem to be doing it every time. They did it in 2016 to make sure that Hillary Clinton became the nominee and not Bernie Sanders. But if Bernie Sanders, who I think should have been the Democratic nominee, what you would have had is a right-wing populist competing against a left-wing populist. So you can see that the populism on both sides of the political spectrum in the West are on the rise. And it's very interesting that they have very similar issues of the populist. Uh, the third point that I want to make is that a lot of the what should we call it, the institutions of European Union, the European Commission, the European Union, the European Human Rights Commission, the European Parliament, the legal system, the bureaucracies that run Europe. Europe is basically run by two governments, nationalist governments and the European government. And so this puts all of this development, this miracle of European Union in jeopardy because of the rise of right-wing parties, which are extreme nationalist also. So what it does is that these right-wing parties will lead to essentially undermining the power of European Union and focus and increase and demand for greater sovereignty for European states. So, for example, the Brexit was led. I mean, one of the biggest and loudest voices for Brexit was Nigel Farage, the extreme far right. So he's not interested in a supranational organization. He wanted his country to have sovereignty over its borders. And if you're a member of the European Union, to some extent, you do not have that. So I feel that not only the centrist liberalism of Europe is going to, it's well more or less over in some ways. But what you're going to see is that these institutions are also going to become increasingly weaker. One of the beneficiaries of that probably is going to be China. So if European Union becomes weak, then Euro-wide sanctions will not be imposed on China. And so the policies dictated by France and Germany and Belgium, or Brussels to some extent, may not have an impact on Chinese exports to Europe. China will be able to then deal with European countries individually, but we are not there yet. The fourth point that I want to raise is, why is this happening? Why are we seeing the rise of right-wing parties? There are several reasons, and my fourth and fifth point essentially address to that. Number one, that all these right-wing parties are basically anti-immigration. They're pro-Russia, so they're anti-Europe's support for Ukraine. They're also anti-European Union, and they are more ethno-nationalist, less multicultural. They're anti-Muslim, and they're also anti-immigration of any kind. So basically, Germany for Germans. That's a kind of sloganeering that these right-wing parties are focused on, and so they are upset with immigrants. I mean, there are layers in it. So first, they don't like immigrants. And among the immigrants, they don't like Muslims the most. And then the second thing is they don't like all brown and black immigrants. And then the third one is they don't even like white immigrants if they are from Eastern Europe or other parts of the world. So basically, they are very anti-immigrant. So they're looking at ethnic purity for the nationalism because they're feeling a tremendous anxiety that their nation states will cease to exist as their nation states, especially with the rise of multiculturalism, multiracialism, multi-religious freedoms, etc. So it's basically becoming less and less liberal. So it's basically an illiberal movement. What is curious about it is that one of the explanations as to why these right-wing parties are so pro-Russia is because apparently the right-wing extremists perceive Russia to be one of the most whitest of countries. And most of Europe has become very multicultural, or at least they talk about multiculturalism, especially after the fiasco of the US invasion in Iraq and the subsequent chaos that emerged in Middle East that eventually led to literally millions of Middle Eastern migrants into Europe. I mean, the Germans went there to bring a million Syrians. They wanted labor. See, that's another issue. The neoliberal economics of Europe needs more people, otherwise they will not grow. All European countries, more or less, their fertility rates are below replacement, so their populations are shrinking. So if they want to continue to have the welfare state, they need more people, and so they have to bring in migrants. Now, that is something that the right-wing people are not able to understand, even though they are more affected by the bad economy. So they are right now suffering because there are not many jobs. The growth rates are very, shall we say, stunted, 1%, 0.5%. These are the kind of growth rates that European countries are talking about. And on top of that, they feel as if they are being crushed by the US, which is showing tremendous progress at 2.5 to 3%, and China. So these two behemoth economies, which are now much bigger than European economy, China is about $1 trillion more than the entire European Union in the size of economy. And in the last 10 years, it went from being less than half of European Union to bigger than European Union. And the US and European Union 10 years ago were on par, and now the US is $10 trillion more than European Union. So all of this anxiety and frustration they're not able to cope with it. And so they're basically targeting immigrants who they feel are taking their jobs away or undermining the national character of their country, etc. They like Russia because they think it is all white country, but someone should tell them that other than the Muslim countries in Europe, like Albania and Bosnia, which are Muslim majority countries, Russia is the most Muslim of all European countries, if you consider Russia as a European country. It's a Eurasian country. So 20% or more of Russian population is Muslim. Probably these right-wing people usually don't go to college or are not very well informed. So their whole perception that Russia is the model of the ethno-national white Christian state, resisting the wokeness, resisting LGBTQ, etc., and sticking to traditional religious and cultural values, they are going to be quite disappointed if they took a closer look at Russia. But nevertheless, this is one of the agendas basically driven by bad economy and the fear of immigration. And essentially, this is European version of culture wars. The fifth point that I have to make is that it's partly because the governments have really been terrible. There's terribly bad governance in Europe. So thinking that new laws will help does not. Take a look at example of this Syrian refugee who attacked and killed 3 Germans just a few days before election. It was as if he was timing his assault to help the far-right party win elections over the weekend. He really pushed, I'm sure he tipped the balance in favor of AfD by going on a rampage with a knife. Once he was caught, it turned out that he's a Syrian refugee who courts had already ordered that he should be deported. So the question is, why wasn't the court order implemented? Why was he still there? The Germans have sent back a few people who committed crimes back to Afghanistan just to pretend as if they are doing something about immigration. Immigrations are of many types. There is legal immigration, there is illegal immigration, there are undocumented people just walking across, then there are refugees who are seeking refuge. So the European immigration scenario is very complicated, and Europeans need that. They need that labor force. They need this. I mean, 1 million new refugees means you have a lot of people who work. Often it's only men who are coming, which means they're going straight into the labor force. And they're also a market. You're selling more falafels. And so there is growth in the economy. But the incompetence of the government it's really very terrible. There are lots of double standards. And you can see that with the war in Ukraine, Russia, and the war in Gaza and Hamas. They talk about human rights from one mouth and sell weapons to kill children in the next instant. So the governance is bad, and it is showing. It is showing in the lack of growth and opportunity for Europeans. So that is another reason why the right is rising, because the center and center left is failing to provide proper governance. There are a lot of horrible people who are being elected. Macron is one idiot. The other idiot was Rishi Sunak, and they failed to deliver. and they fail to deliver on the promises they have made. The sixth thing that I wanted to say about the rise of the right-wing parties is that these parties are anti-global. They are anti-globalist, so they are very nationalistic, ethno-nationalistic, very local. They're also anti-American in some ways. They're also anti-Europe Union. And so it raises the question that if right-wing parties continue to win elections, both locally and in European countries and in European Union, will the infrastructure that Europe has built, this whole governance, this kind of global governance kind of or regional governance format, which creates a huge common market and provides economies of scale to all of Europe, helps the lesser advanced European countries to develop on the back of Germany's economy and France and Britain. Well, Britain is now out. So the question is that if this trend of right-wing parties continue to win elections in Europe, there's a pretty good chance that we will see more wars in Europe. I mean, if 10 years ago we had talked about a long 2.5-year war in Europe, people would have laughed at you and said, how is that possible? Well, you've had one. So there is a war in Europe that's going on, reminiscent of the kind of wars that were fought in Europe in the 20th century. But there are now riots in the streets, like you saw in Britain just a couple of weeks ago. So there's going to be domestic social disharmony, bad governance, economic stagnation, political paralysis, and on top of that, insecurity. And then in this scenario, Europe is going to enter into what the United States is going to do, which is drag NATO and EU into a Cold War with China, and that's not in the Europe's interest. Let me give you just one example before I wind up. In the past month or so, both the United States and Canada have imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. This is part of the containment project of China. The way to contain the growth of China's power is to contain the growth of their economy. So the Chinese are in some way right that the United States is impeding their economic development. And in the process also hurting Americans. Now we don't get to, you can't afford Tesla, it's so expensive, and you can't buy very good electric vehicles, which would have been cheaper if there were no tariffs. But the European Union has imposed only a temporary tariff of 37%, and it hasn't gone up to 50 or 100%. Now, why is Europe doing that? Because Europe manufactures its cars in China. China is now manufacturing cars to some extent in Hungary, Serbia, and maybe even in Italy. So what's going to happen once this customs regime comes is German cars are going to be taxed heavily because of this, because they're going to be manufactured in China. And Chinese cars might actually be able to dodge the European Union's tariff regime by being made in Europe itself. Yes, that will bring in investments and jobs. So you can see every other month you see either Macron or just last week, Meloni, all going to China, seeking Chinese investments inside the European Union, in their country. So what is going to happen is that Europe is going to become a total mess, if it's not already a total mess. So basically, to sum up, the rise of right-wing parties are frightening. These are very, very nasty people. There are some people in India who might like them thinking they are right-wing parties. Believe me, they are not. They don't have the conception of a good immigrant and a bad immigrant. Oh, if the immigrant is from India and he's a Muslim, then he's bad. And if the immigrant is from India and he's Hindu, he's good. No, they hate everybody who does not look like them. And you can see this hatred here, even in the US, the amount of hate the MAGA people express for J.D. Vance's wife, Usha Vance, is shocking. And you could see some pastors, just Google it on YouTube, giving sermons against Vivek Ramaswamy and asking questions. Is he going to bring his idols into the White House? So there is a lot of hatred of people who are not Christians, not from the Judeo-Christian tradition, who are not white, and who are not, well, from their own quote-unquote stock. The Germans like to use the word stock. So Europe is going to basically be turning its back to the post-colonial era European values, the Enlightenment European values of pluralism, of democracy, of human rights, etc. So basically, Europe is having a crisis of legitimacy and a crisis of morality. If it's going to turn its back to the very values that defined Europe for nearly a century now, what values are going to replace the core of European identity? That is a serious question that Europeans will need to answer with the right of right-wing parties. The second thing is, given the fact that we live in a highly integrated world, economies, governance-wise, especially with common challenges such as climate change, as well as pandemics, is Europe going to be a drag for the rest of the world, or will Europe remain a force for good for the rest of the world? That is the next big question that needs to be answered. I don't have answers for that now, but I'm not very optimistic. So anyway, I hope I gave you a lot of food for thought. So please subscribe to Khanversation, like this video, press the bell icon, and don't forget to share it with your social political network. And of course, if you like Khanversations, don't forget to join and become a member and support Khanversations. Until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.